We start by working 2 setup rounds. In the first round, we work the sequence of knit 1 and slip 1 purlwise with the yarn at the front of the work. So we bring the yarn to the front and slip the stitch purlwise without twisting it. Then we bring the yarn to the back and repeat the same thing. Knit 1, yarn to the front, slip, yarn to the back, and so on until we get to the end of the round. Because we work over an even number of stitches, when you rearrange the needles to work the second round, make sure you don't lose this last slipped stitch. So the yarn at the front should stay at the front, don't lose it. And in the second round, we work the sequence of slip 1 purlwise with the yarn at the back of the work, so the yarn stays at the back, and then we bring the yarn to the front of the work and purl 1 stitch. And again, we repeat it until we get to the end of the round. These 2 rounds form the tube that gives the name to this bind-off method, tubular. Now that the tube is in place, we can move on to the final part of the process, the bind-off itself. We're going to close the stitches with the wool needle, and that means 2 things. We need a wool needle and we need to leave a pretty long tail to make sure we have enough yarn to bind off all stitches. The tail should be at least 3 times the length of the bind-off edge. So you could simply place the yarn on the bind-off edge to measure 1 length and then fold the yarn 3 times, at least 3 times, and then cut the yarn. But frankly, I usually leave a tail that is 4 times the length just to be sure that I don't run out of yarn. To make it easier for you to see how this bind-off works, I attached a piece of yarn in a contrasting color, as if it were my actual yarn tail, and I threaded it into a wool needle. Now I'm ready to bind off stitches. The first step of the bind-off is the most awkward one, but we need it to make sure the bind-off edge looks fully seamless. So place the wool needle to the back of the first knit stitch, like this, and then insert it from left to right into the first purl stitch, like this. See? And then pull the yarn through. From now on, we're going to join stitches in pairs. We're going to join knits to knits and purls to purls. And we'll start by joining 2 knit stitches. Insert the wool needle from left to right into the first knit stitch on the knitting needle. Slip the stitch off the needle and insert the wool needle from right to left into the next knit stitch. See, we skip the purl, we go into the knit stitch. And then slip all of these stitches, the purl, because it already has yarn in there, so it's not going to go anywhere, right? And the second knit stitch off the knitting needle. The thing is that we're going to use these first knit and purl stitches again at the end of the bind-off to join the bind-off in the round. And it helps a lot to place stitch markers into these stitches to make sure we'll find those stitches in the fabric later on. So right now, while you have these stitches clearly visible, take a locking stitch marker or a safety pin or something and place it into the first knit stitch, and take another one and place it into the first purl stitch. It is especially helpful if you work with fine yarn or if you work with the yarn in a dark color. And then pull the yarn through, but don't pull the yarn too tight. Now we're gonna start to form the bind-off edge, and the strand that stays on top of the edge should be about as long as 1 leg of the stitch. So we don't pull it all the way like this, we kind of mold this seam. So we make the leg, the strand as long as 1 leg of the stitch. So now 2 knit stitches are joined and we're gonna move to purls. And that's gonna be the next step. Insert the wool needle from back to front into the purl stitch that is already slipped. So this is the one that has marker in it right now. And from left to right, that is from front to back, basically, if we look at the stitch, into the first purl stitch that sits on the knitting needle. So we go back to front into the slipped one and front to back into the next one. Slip the stitch off the knitting needle and pull the yarn through, again, not all the way through, not too tight, but forming a nice strand on top of the bind of edge. And then we move to knits again. So we go front to back into the knit stitch that is slipped from the needle, and back to front, that is right to left, into the stitch that is sitting on the needle. Slip the stitch off and pull the yarn through, forming that nice strand on top of the seam. And then purls again, back to front into the slipped purl stitch, front to back or left to right into the one that sits on the needle. And that's basically the logic behind it. So we join stitches in pairs, knits to knits, purls to purls, and we go front to back, back to front into the knits, pull the yarn through, mold that nice strand, and back to front, front to back into the purls. And keep going until you join all stitches and your knitting needles are empty. And I join the last pair of purls, make this nice strand on top of the seam, and now I can put the knitting needles aside. The stitches are closed, but we have this ugly gap over here and we're gonna deal with it right away. To close the gap, we're going to join the last knit stitch to the first knit stitch and the last purl stitch to the first purl stitch, and that's when we can truly appreciate the help of these markers. We'll start with knit stitches. The logic is the same. We go front to back into the last knit stitch and back to front into the first knit stitch. Remove the marker, put it aside, and pull the yarn through, again forming this nice strand on top of the seam. And then we go to purls. We go back to front into the last purl, and then we find that other marker to find that stitch, the first purl, and we go front to back into that stitch. Remove the marker and pull the yarn through. And as you pull the yarn through, you will see that this last strand, it kind of finishes off the whole thing. It instantly makes the bind of edge look seamless. And as you have the yarn tail already in the wool needle, you can simply secure the yarn and weave it in on the wrong side of the work. I'm going to just tuck it in into this little swatch. And we're going to take a closer look at the seam itself. So the bind of edge looks perfect. It looks great. It looks like a continuation of the 1x1 ribbing. And of course, if you make it with the yarn in the same color as the project, then it will be completely invisible and look very well finished. This type of bind of edge is great for finishing off anything worked in 1x1 ribbing, but we can also use this method to finish off projects worked in any other stitch pattern. Even this humble stockinette stitch gets an upgrade with this beautiful edging worked with the Tubular bind off. It still has a texture of the 1x1 ribbing, but it looks pretty nice, like a really nice elaborate edging. To get more details about this method, go to 10rowsaday.com/tubular-bindoff-round. Happy knitting, my friend. I'll talk to you in the next tutorial.